The sun hung low in the sky over Fairview, Ohio, casting a golden glow across the quiet suburban street where Marcus Bennett lived. A private man, Marcus preferred to keep to himself, working from home, maintaining his neatly trimmed yard, and only speaking to his neighbors when necessary. Most people respected his space. That was until one ordinary Thursday afternoon turned into something far from normal. Marcus had just wrapped up a long morning of work and decided to check his Wi-Fi settings. Lately, his internet had been slower than usual, videos buffering, music lagging, calls dropping. At first, he blamed his service provider, but something felt off. Curious, he dug into his router settings, and that's when he saw it, an unknown device connected to his network. The name wasn't random letters and numbers. It was labeled Fairview I01. Marcus frowned. He lived alone. His devices were minimal: a phone, a laptop, a TV. He never shared his password, and he certainly didn't recognize this one. Annoyed, he decided to remove all unknown connections and reset his password. Stepping outside for a better signal, he leaned against the side of his house, typing in the new credentials on his phone. That's when Karen Whitman saw him. From her kitchen window, Karen noticed Marcus standing in his driveway, staring at his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. To her, it looked suspicious. She had never trusted him, not for any real reason, but simply because he kept to himself. He didn't attend block parties, didn't make small talk, and barely acknowledged anyone in the neighborhood. Now, there he was, tapping away at his phone, standing still for way too long. Her mind jumped to the worst conclusion. He's hacking something. Karen didn't hesitate. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911. Yes, I need to report something suspicious. My neighbor is outside doing something strange with his phone. I don't know what exactly, but it looks off. Can you send someone to check it out? The dispatcher asked a few questions, but Karen had no real answers. She just kept repeating, "Something isn't right. I just know it." The police were on their way. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea his peaceful afternoon was about to turn into an interrogation. 20 minutes later, the distant wail of sirens broke through the quiet neighborhood. Marcus barely noticed, until he saw a squad car pulling up right in front of his house. Two officers stepped out. Detective Grant Mitchell, tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp, assessing gaze. Beside him was Officer Lisa Parker, compact but firm, exuding quiet authority. Marcus let out a slow breath. Here we go. He remained still as the officers approached. Mitchell's hand hovered near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to send a message. "Sir," Mitchell called out, voice steady, "we got a call about suspicious activity. Can you tell us what you're doing?" Marcus frowned, glancing between the two officers. "Suspicious activity?" he echoed. "I'm changing my Wi-Fi password." But from the looks on their faces, it was clear they weren't convinced. The accusation and the discovery. Marcus crossed his arms, his voice firm but calm. "I live here. I've been living here for 3 years." Detective Mitchell exchanged a glance with Officer Parker before turning back to him. "Do you have any proof of residence?" Marcus almost laughed. His car was in the driveway. His name was on the mailbox. Proof? He shouldn't have to prove anything. Before he could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "He's lying." Marcus turned toward the source of the accusation. Karen Whitman stood on her porch, arms folded, eyes locked onto him like a self-appointed neighborhood watch captain. "He's always outside doing something suspicious," she continued, "always on his phone, looking around like he's watching people. And now he's standing in the same spot for 10 minutes. Just tapping away? What else could he be doing?" Marcus couldn't believe it. She was serious. "I was checking my router settings," he said flatly, "because someone I don't know has been using my Wi-Fi." Karen scoffed. "Oh, sure, and I'm just supposed to believe that?" Detective Mitchell turned to her, his tone slightly more skeptical. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence that Mr. Bennett has done anything illegal?" Karen hesitated. Of course, she didn't. I don't know," she admitted, faltering. "I just think you should check." Mitchell exhaled, his patience thinning. He turned back to Marcus. "Sir, would you mind showing us your router settings? Just to clear this up?" Marcus clenched his jaw. He shouldn't have to prove anything. But he also knew how fast situations like this could spiral out of control. After a long pause, he sighed. Fine. Unlocking his phone, he pulled up the router settings and handed it to Mitchell. The detective leaned in, scanning the list of connected devices. Then his expression changed. Because there it was, Fairview I-01. Mitchell's brows furrowed. Who owns that device? Marcus shook his head. Not me. Officer Parker stepped forward, eyebrows raised. So someone's been using your Wi-Fi without permission? Marcus nodded. And I don't think they were just stealing internet. He tapped the screen. Look at the connection logs. That device has been active nonstop. A beat of silence. Mitchell straightened up, his stance shifting. This wasn't just about a nosy neighbor and a misunderstanding anymore. Karen, who had been standing smugly a moment ago, suddenly looked uncomfortable. Wait, what do you mean? Marcus turned to her, eyes cold. I mean someone has been spying. And they might be watching all of us. The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Karen's face paled. This wasn't what she expected. Mitchell's voice was sharper now. All right, let's get inside. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with. Marcus nodded and led them toward his house. His frustration burned beneath the surface. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here he was, being treated like a suspect in his own home. A darker truth unfolds. Inside his home, Marcus led Detective Mitchell and Officer Parker to his dining table, where his laptop was already open. He mirrored his router settings onto the screen, letting them see the full list of connected devices. And there it was again, Fairview I-01. Officer Parker leaned in, scanning the details. Can you tell what kind of device this is? Marcus clicked through the logs, his fingers moving fast. Not exactly, but wait. His hand suddenly froze over the keyboard. Detective Mitchell immediately noticed the change in his expression. What is it? Marcus swallowed hard. This device, it's been accessing camera feeds. The room fell into an eerie silence. Karen, who had been standing with her arms crossed just minutes ago, now looked completely lost. Camera feeds? She echoed. What camera feeds? Marcus turned the laptop toward them, his stomach twisting. Mine. He clicked open the logs, showing the connection activity. Someone has been remotely logging into my home security cameras. Officer Parker's expression tightened. Wait, you're saying someone has been spying on you, through your own security system? Marcus exhaled sharply. That's exactly what I'm saying. Detective Mitchell leaned in, his tone more serious now. How long has this been going on? Marcus scrolled down. Months. Karen's face drained of color. But then, Marcus's stomach dropped. Because the more he scrolled, the more he realized it wasn't just his cameras being accessed. His system had flagged multiple IP addresses. Some of them belonged to his home network, but others belonged to different houses. Officer Parker saw it at the same time. Oh, hell no. Karen took a step back, shaking her head. No, that can't be right. Marcus turned to her, his eyes cold. You sure about that? With a few more clicks, a new feed appeared. A dimly lit hallway, a living room, a bedroom. Karen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Because the bedroom on the screen? It was hers. Detective Mitchell's posture stiffened. How the hell is this happening? Marcus clenched his jaw. If I had to guess? Someone in the neighborhood set up a fake Wi-Fi network. Something that looks normal, like a guest connection. People unknowingly connect to it. And once they do, their devices get compromised. Officer Parker's face darkened. You're talking about a man-in-the-middle attack. Marcus nodded. Exactly. Karen looked like she was about to be sick. So you're saying, someone has been watching me? Watching my family? Her voice shook. Marcus's eyes didn't leave hers. That's exactly what I'm saying. Karen sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Oh my God. Detective Mitchell's jaw tightened. All right, we need to figure out who's behind this, fast. But none of them knew. The person responsible was a lot closer than they thought. The shocking discovery. Detective Mitchell wasted no time. He grabbed his radio, his voice sharp. Dispatch. We need cybercrime support at Fairview Drive. Possible network surveillance breach. Suspect may be local. Officer Parker turned to Marcus. Can you trace where the data is going? Marcus was already typing, his heart pounding. He wasn't a hacker, but he knew enough about network security to dig deeper. He pulled up the IP logs, cross-referencing connection timestamps with network signals. And then, he froze. Detective Mitchell immediately picked up on it. "What is it?" Marcus turned his laptop toward them. "This can't be right. The data wasn't being sent to some random outside server. It was being sent to an address right here in the neighborhood." Karen's eyes widened. "You mean, someone close by is behind this?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Not just close, a few doors down." Detective Mitchell's expression darkened. "Can you pinpoint exactly which house?" Marcus's fingers flew over the keyboard, scanning for the strongest signal source. Within minutes, he had a match. His stomach sank. He recognized the address. Karen saw it, too. Her face turned pale. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. That's Brandon's house." Marcus went stiff. Brandon Foster? Karen's own nephew. A 22-year-old college student who had moved in with her a few months ago. Marcus clenched his jaw. "You have got to be kidding me." Karen staggered backward, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, this doesn't make sense. Brandon isn't like that. He couldn't. Officer Parker wasn't buying it. We need to talk to him. Now." Karen hesitated, her breath shaky. Deep down, something in her gut told her it was true. "I'll take you to him," she murmured. Marcus stood up. "I'm coming too." Detective Mitchell shot him a warning glance. "No, you stay here. Let us handle this." Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew pushing back wouldn't help. "Fine," he muttered, "but you'd better get the truth out of him." Confronting the suspect, Karen's hands shook as she led the officers down the street to her house. Every step felt heavier than the last. Brandon, the kid she had raised, supported, and helped through school, it couldn't be him. And yet, a tiny voice in her head whispered, "What if it is?" She opened the front door, her voice unsteady. "Brandon, can you come downstairs for a minute?" Silence. Detective Mitchell exchanged a look with Officer Parker before stepping inside. "We're going up." Karen didn't argue. She just wrapped her arms around herself, trying to control her breathing. They climbed the stairs, reaching Brandon's bedroom door. It was shut. No sounds inside. Detective Mitchell knocked hard. "Brandon, this is the police. Open the door." Still nothing. Then, the sound of movement. A chair scraping. Footsteps. Officer Parker's hand hovered over her holster. "Open the door. Now." A long pause. Then, the knob slowly turned. The door creaked open. Brandon Foster stood in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes darting between Detective Mitchell, Officer Parker, and his aunt. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he was gripping something invisible. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. Detective Mitchell studied him. "We have reason to believe you've been accessing private security cameras in the neighborhood." "Want to explain that?" Brandon's face didn't change, but his fingers curled tighter. "That's crazy," he scoffed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Officer Parker wasn't buying it. "Mind if we check your laptop?" Brandon's jaw tightened. "You don't have a warrant." Detective Mitchell stepped closer. "Brandon, we can get one, but right now, we're giving you a chance to tell the truth before this gets worse." A long, tense silence. Then, Brandon exhaled. He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, But Detective Mitchell cut him off. "Why is your IP address linked to a network breach involving multiple homes?" Brandon froze. Karen's voice broke. "Brandon, please tell me you're not involved in this." Brandon's eyes flickered to her. And for the first time, his mask cracked. He looked guilty. I didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered. Karen staggered backward. Detective Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "How far did it go?" Brandon swallowed. His voice dropped. "I don't know." Karen covered her mouth, trembling. Officer Parker took a step forward. "Brandon Foster, you're under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance." Brandon's face went pale. "Wait, no, But he didn't resist. Officer Parker pulled out the handcuffs. Karen turned away, tears brimming in her eyes. Marcus had been right all along. And the worst part? She had called the cops on him, when the real danger had been inside her own house the whole time. The truth comes to light. Brandon stood frozen, his wrists now bound in cuffs. His face was pale, his eyes darting between his aunt, the officers, and the floor beneath him. Detective Mitchell tightened his grip on Brandon's arm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Karen covered her mouth, her hands trembling. "Brandon, how could you?" Brandon didn't answer. His jaw was clenched, his body stiff. Marcus stood outside, watching from the sidewalk as the officers led Brandon out the front door. His gut churned. He had been right about the hacking. But this was worse than he expected. Brandon wasn't just stealing internet, he had been violating people's privacy, spying on them in their own homes. And yet, the irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He was the one Karen had called the cops on. Not Brandon, not the actual criminal. Him, facing the consequences. As Detective Mitchell guided Brandon toward the patrol car, he paused and turned to Marcus. "You were right." The words felt heavy, a rare acknowledgement from an officer. "If you hadn't caught this, we might have never known." Marcus exhaled, nodding slightly. "Yeah, I know." Karen stepped forward, her voice small. "Marcus, I was wrong." Marcus turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "I made an assumption," she continued, "and it was completely unfair." There it was, an apology. Marcus let the silence stretch. Then, shaking his head, he said, "I don't need an apology." Karen's brows furrowed, confused. Marcus looked her dead in the eye. "Just do better." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his house. The aftermath. Brandon didn't fight. He sat in the back of the police car, staring straight ahead, his hands still cuffed. The weight of his actions was finally hitting him. Officer Parker turned to Karen. "We'll be conducting a full investigation. There may be more victims." Karen nodded slowly, but she still looked dazed, as if the reality of the situation hadn't fully sunk in. Marcus, back inside his home, locked his door and sat down in front of his laptop. His Wi-Fi was still compromised. Brandon had invaded his privacy, spied on him, made him a target, and yet, the cops had shown up for him, not Brandon. It made his stomach turn. People like Karen would always assume the worst about him before ever questioning the real threat. Because of the color of his skin. And that was the part that stung the most. Justice served. Over the next few weeks, the truth unraveled. Brandon was charged with multiple counts of unauthorized access and unlawful surveillance. More neighbors came forward, horrified to learn that their own security cameras had been accessed. Brandon had been watching them for months. Some of them pressed charges. Karen stopped attending neighborhood gatherings. She avoided eye contact with Marcus whenever she saw him outside. She had been so convinced that he was the problem, but the real danger had been right under her nose. Marcus, on the other hand, didn't change much. He still minded his business, kept to himself, and stayed out of neighborhood drama. But now he made sure his Wi-Fi was locked down tighter than ever. A lesson learned. One evening, as Marcus stepped outside to check his mailbox, Karen approached him. She looked hesitant, clutching a small container in her hands. "Marcus, I baked these for you." He looked at the cookies, then at her face. She was trying to make up for it. But some things couldn't be erased with cookies. Marcus sighed, then shook his head. "Keep them, Karen." She hesitated. I wanted to say I'm sorry again." Marcus met her gaze. "Yeah." A long pause. Then, finally, he said, "Next time, when something doesn't seem right, ask before you assume." Karen swallowed hard. "I will." She turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, the cool evening air settling between them. The damage had been done. But maybe, just maybe, she would think twice before calling the cops on the wrong person again. The takeaway: assumptions have consequences. Jumping to conclusions based on bias or paranoia can ruin innocent lives while the real threat goes unchecked. Instead of making judgments without evidence, take a step back, observe, listen, because sometimes, the truth isn't what you expect.